Buongiorno! Yeah, sorry about the hiatus, life gets in the way and all that. In light of recent events at the time of recording, how about we take a look at an open-ended FPS developed and published by a Polish company that starts with C and suffered from numerous delays? Yeah, we're talking about Enemy Front. It's kinda hard to believe that Enemy Front was in development at around the same time as Sniper Ghost Warrior 2, considering how wildly different their approaches are. I've already discussed SGW2, an overly safe, handholdy rail shooter that I was frankly too nice to. What the hell was I talking about? On the other hand, while the initial description and previews in 2011 and 12 painted it as a pretty basic FPS, Enemy Front seemingly became more and more ambitious as time went on, with later blurbs in 2013 touting it as the first truly modern World War II FPS, with supposedly a strong focus on player agency. SGW2's Siberian Strike dabbled with this a little, but this would be the first time that they've marketed an entire game around this principle. I see it as the catalyst for how they would design their future titles. However, such a massive revision comes at a cost. As I've mentioned, the game's dev cycle was as much of a tumultuous time as the events it depicts, seeing a producer switch, which is what likely caused the change in focus in the first place, no less than 4 delays and a lot of cut content. Thus, when the final product was shoved out the door in June 2014, needless to say, it wasn't greeted with a saucer of milk. Are you fucking serious? Making matters worse, guess what game came out a month earlier and took Nazi killing to new heights? I'm gonna be straight up honest with you. I used to really like this game. I've defended this game a few times in previous videos. I even wrote a massive positive review on Steam when I first played it in late 2019. While I still think it represents a big step forward for our Polish underdogs and can absolutely praise this game for certain things, I've since realized that it's been sheltering enemies of the state. For a backdrop as generic and overused as World War II, Enemy Front actually tries to spice things up a little by forgoing the typical characters and locations, which is something that I greatly appreciate. Once upon a time in, rather fittingly, Nazi-occupied Poland, instead of being just another enlisted soldier among thousands, you fight alongside your fellow partisans. You know, there's something really nice about seeing CI pay respects and represent their own country's history and struggles. Shame he still plays a fucking American. To be fair though, Robert Hawkins isn't exactly your typical burly American. While he can more or less fight like one, he's actually a war correspondent whose primary motive isn't to help out or collect Nazi scalps per se, but rather to selfishly get stories for a newspaper.
I'm staying. I finally found my next big story. I'm gonna cover the resistance movement from the inside. I've got the ultimate scoop with guaranteed front page headlines.
So that's it, huh? We're all here fighting for your pleasure, your career.
Listen, sweetheart. We all have our reasons to fight this war. If the end result is defeating the Nazis, then who cares how you come to the fight?
Not gonna lie, this is a way more interesting concept, and I really dig how mildly morally gray it is. Furthermore, Enemy Front's levels follow the less used areas and events around Europe during World War II, which is really neat. Instead of fighting in the streets of Berlin, you're in the streets of Warsaw during the uprising. Instead of going to Normandy in northern France, you head to the French countryside to aid the resistance. Instead of going to a cliched area that isn't Norway, you go to Norway and take part in the legendary heavy water sabotage. The Forest and V2 factory in Germany covering Operation Crossbow aren't nearly as interesting as the others, but 3 out of 4 ain't bad. But despite all these interesting sounding story beats and the fact that you play as a literal gaming journalist, Enemy Front's narrative is inconsequential and forgettable, so much to the point where I have absolutely nothing to save and discuss for later on. The entire story is told with a combination of flashbacks and time skips, so the whole thing feels like a slice of life thing with guns and zero cohesion. Not like that! The individual stories in each location are also quite dull as well. Even though they cover forgotten World War II events, it's all presented really blandly in a way I can't describe. Things just kinda happen as Hawkins tries to sniff out more headlines and the characters are forgettable. You'd have a more interesting time reading a Wikipedia article on them. Hell, here's the final cutscene. I'd rate a better segue, but I refuse to put more effort into ending this section than EF's writers. CryEngine 3 returns for another CI game, and again, despite being in development at pretty much the same time as SGW2, Enemy Front generally looks a lot prettier than most of what that game was able to offer. I think it's mostly the lighting, and in my opinion, just the right amount of bloom and other effects like God Rays that tie everything together into a much more atmospheric and less flat-looking game. Whatever CI did during that extra year of development, they've clearly gotten a better grasp on the CryEngine aesthetic. Each of the aforementioned locations has its own unique vibe. The depressing state of besieged Warsaw is well depicted with all the death, destruction, and direness cascaded in a reddish-brown color palette. That moodiness gets even stronger in one level where you're fighting off Nazis in the rain at night. The French countryside is genuinely stunning overall, and I love it. It has the best lighting out of all the game's settings, tons of lush vegetation, vibrant colors, highly detailed ruins, and a certain quaintness and peacefulness in spite of all the Nazis everywhere. I dare say it's so borderline photorealistic that I'm half expecting to be approached by a Standarten Führer for a glass of milk. Non, vous ne pouvez pas boire du lait! Va te faire foutre! The Norway levels do a nice job at feeling appropriately chilly through the use of a muted color palette, and I actually don't mind the slightly overbearing bloom and light rays since they add to the snowy atmosphere. I really don't have too much to say about the levels in Germany. They don't do very much to stand out compared to the last three and are rather bland, but the same comments about the nice lighting still apply in spots at least. Even the loading screens look rad. They're obviously compressed to hell, but the whole camera panning through a frozen scene thing is always a win in my book. But naturally, the convincing enough facade immediately shatters if you look a little too close at even the best looking levels, like telling a shitty lie about how you broke your leg. Just to name a few standout blunders, sometimes the lighting will pop in and out of existence, textures are rough even at max settings, vegetation is also low res and 2D, sometimes people in the distance aren't lit properly at all, sometimes plants aren't shaded, character animations can be jank, indoor areas can look subpar, etc. The lens flares can also be really overbearing, but thankfully you can tweak the system.cfg file and add a command to turn them off. While you're there, you can also adjust the FOV. I'm not sure where else to mention this, but on the topic of technical issues, the audio mixing for enemy lines can be really weird. Occasionally you'll get an earful of Nazi ASMR even if there's no one next to you.
The next rounds are for you. Talk.
Findet ihn.
Despite these issues though, I'm willing to look past them in favor of how damn nice the bigger picture is. Something else that I cannot understate is how great the music is. Composed by Chris Velasco, who you might know from more popular titles such as Mass Effect or God of War, Enemy Front's soundtrack consists of genuinely beautiful classical music. While arguably a bit on the generic side, it's the melodic cream on the atmospheric strudel. Here's a few I really like. I must say I grow wary of these monkey shines. Let's point a gun at someone's testicles and talk about gameplay. The gunplay is just about average, which considering the last CI game we looked at that gave us access to automatic weapons, thank fuck. It's actually really hard to describe it without making comparisons to, well, most Call of Duties. The overall handling and feel is basically the same and is serviceable enough, with almost nothing major to really move it away from that baseline. That said, there are still a few things I want to praise and critique. The ability to carry 2 guns and a sidearm is more than welcome. Even if the sidearm slot is usually inconsequential, it's really convenient if you happen to find a well rod, a silenced pistol, which means you can have your stealth weapon, a close range weapon, and a long range weapon. Can never carry too many guns after all. On that note, the reloading animations are honestly pretty smooth as far as CI's products go. There's obviously some room for improvement, but I'd say that they're finally within the realm of looking somewhat natural. The first 2 SGW games sometimes had issues with stiffness or floatiness. And speaking of those games, enemy front sniper rifles take a page out of them by adding the slightest bit of travel time. While you don't need to compensate for wind or bullet drop, it makes hitting a moving target a little more challenging and rewarding as you go full Frederick Zoller on the Nazis. Wait a fucking second. The game even sees the return of bullet cams. Although the cinematography lacks variety, they use the same weak sounds as SGW2. And again, they disable the motion blur after one trigger, so I don't like them. While there's no option to turn them off in-game, you can actually get rid of them by editing the config file. As for the negatives, the gun sounds are mostly subpar. You'll occasionally have some that sound pretty good, like the Kar 98K, and of all things, the M1911, which absolutely slaps. But you'll probably never use it. On the other hand, the rest generally aren't up to that same standard for a variety of reasons. A couple of guns have this issue where the shots seem to cut off the previous one with automatic fire, one of which is the MP40, the most common gun in the game. Other guns either feel a bit weak or too stock sounding for their own good. It's just really inconsistent. A few other quirks I came across are 1, the sounds aren't even slowed down properly when you do one of those slow-mo breaches. And 2, tap firing some guns can, break them. More importantly though, the way the game handles reloads is actually terrible. I think? Here's the thing, I was originally gonna talk about reload canceling. Feature where the gun is registered as loaded the moment the reload animation shows you inserting a new mag, and at that point you could shave off a few milliseconds by interrupting the animation, usually by sprinting. I was gonna say how it's in most games, but after trying a handful of random FPSs I had installed, only COD had it, which almost entirely destroys the point I wanted to make! So this is perhaps more of a personal issue rather than a contradiction of FPS norms, but nevertheless it messed with my muscle memory. It'll only refill the ammo counter once the animation returns the gun back to its original position. This is why you might have seen me reload, sprint, and then reload again in some of these clips. Not sure what else to say besides that it's a massive pain in the ass and nearly drops the gunplay below the COD average. Still better than SGW1. As for the AI, it's generally fine, but if there are any irregularities to be found, rest assured they will be. Now, let's head to places it would never occur to a hawk to hide and talk about stealth. As one would expect, I'm a little mixed on it. In my experience, the detection felt predictable and fair enough for the vast majority of the time. There were still a few moments where I was spotted instantly or even for no reason in particular, but frankly, these flubs were infrequent enough that I don't think they define the stealth overall, unlike, say, SGW1. However, something that really irks me is that enemy front's detection meter behaves more like that game rather than its sequel. To recap, SGW2's meter actually pointed in the direction you were being spotted from and paired it with an obvious sound cue to let you know you're in danger. In this game, the utter vagueness of the UI can lead to annoying moments like this. I know I'm being spotted, but I have no idea where from, so I have no idea where to hide. Enemies don't even have suspicious lines for when they're about to spot you, so I pretty much had no chance here. It's moments like this where I wish the game had a prone option like SGW. As for the sound cue, a subtle gun click will play when the meter is initially triggered. I've now basically been conditioned to clench my sphincter whenever I hear that sound when I'm not expecting it. It generally works well enough, but if the meter starts going back up again while the meter isn't completely drained, the sound cue won't play at all, so you might have to keep an extra close eye on it. When you get up close to an enemy, you have the option of either going for a melee takedown or taking him hostage. The former is almost entirely useless. While you can trigger it from a little further away, the janky animation that ensues takes absurdly long and can get you caught if poorly timed. It's much more practical to do the latter. Killing them this way will only take a fraction of the time. You can also carefully drag an enemy out of sight this way, and if you have a well rod, pop another badman at the same time for a quick and quiet double kill. It's a really nice feature that I wish was in CI's later titles. On a related note, you can finally move bodies, but it's not super practical. Because you move so slowly when carrying someone, it's only useful for minor adjustments, not so much for moving a body out in the open. Interestingly, you could still fire your sidearm at the same time, which again should have been used in newer games. Suppressed weapons generally make the stealth a lot easier if you can get your hands on them. In some missions you'll spawn with them, but other times you'll have to scour the map for one. The aforementioned well rod and the Delisle carbine are your standard slow firing stealth guns. Well placed shots will instantly drop someone, missed ones will punish you, and neither are that practical when shit hits the fan. Both are pretty much usurped by the much more versatile Sten, a suppressed SMG which will allow you to silently spray down multiple enemies without raising an alarm and is still perfectly usable in loud scenarios. As for your other stealth tools, you've got binoculars, rocks, and sound masking. The binoculars are, unlike SGW2, actually useful this time. While they're still a bit redundant on lower difficulties because enemies are automatically marked on your minimap, this doesn't happen on Expert, but you retain the ability to take enemies, making recon an option. Unfortunately, tagging can be super temperamental at times and will refuse to work even if you're staring directly at an unobscured enemy. It's still better than nothing, I guess. Rock throwing is a welcome addition and pretty much works as you'd expect, although sometimes they refuse to make any sort of noise and not distract an enemy when they land. Sound masking is a feature that allows you to fire unsilenced weapons alongside loud environmental sounds without drawing attention, as designated by an icon that 100% isn't ripped straight from Sniper Elite. It pretty much works without a hitch, but it's somewhat uncommon and, to be really nitpicky, makes zero sense sometimes. Trying to hide a 140 decibel gunshot with a sputtering car engine is like pretending to be Italian when you're from Tennessee.
Gorlami.
To be totally honest though, as janky as it sometimes can be, I usually try to use a stealthy approach whenever possible. Because the combat is as average as it is, sneaking around actually excites me more and allows me to get the absolute most out of the more open levels. Before we analyze the levels in finer detail, it's perhaps useful to first consult the marketing blurb on Steam to make some broader remarks about the campaign, because it's rather hyperbolic in some aspects. Like I said earlier, Enemy Front prides itself on open-ended levels, but in reality, only 8 out of the 16 levels feel like they even remotely fit the description. And even then, some are a lot smaller than others, some have a small section of freedom sandwiched between the more scripted affair, and some just have shit design. Calling the game a richly interactive combat experience is pretty much nonsense. At best, you'll have a gramophone that you can turn off to lure enemies or the odd destructible trap, and that's it. And as for it being highly replayable, I like some of the more open levels, but there generally aren't that many ways to go about most of them, especially if you go loud. There's also plenty of instances of what I like to call false agency, little things that CI perhaps included to try to add to the sense of freedom, but are ultimately inconsequential to the experience. Going in ascending order of patheticness, the game regularly gives you optional side objectives like save this person or destroy these things, but there's no real reason to go for them since you usually get nothing. At best, there's a civilian in one level that will lead you to a hidden cellar containing an STG-44, a good and rare rifle, but not a game changer. Next are the few instances where the game gives you a couple of ways to go about your mission, but in this case, I don't mean an open map. I'm talking about how, for example, there's the sniping section in Mission 4 where you're given a choice between two vantage points that are literally mere meters apart and do not change how the level plays out. The dumbest bit of false agency are easily the moments where the game makes this whole song and dance about giving you a choice between two guns. While technically your choice might change the way you approach a situation, there's nothing stopping you from changing your mind immediately after. I'm not even mad, I'm just confused. They could have just placed the two guns on a table and maybe have someone make a small gesture towards it. Another thing I wanted to bring up is the map. Normally these are quite handy in games with open-ended levels, but here it's just bad. It doesn't actually show your exact location, nor can you zoom into each individual hotspot, so it's entirely useless for getting your bearings. Not that the maps are so big that you'd absolutely need it, but it's still a weird blunder to me. Finally, it's important to note that weapons don't carry over level transitions, which is extremely apparent in missions 5 through 7, where it's all set in the same location with no time skips or any real reason for your loadout to change. So if you had a Wellrod or Sten, you'll have to find it again. Starting with the levels I enjoyed the most overall, Enemy Front is at its very best when it drops you into a rather large map with at least a few effective ways of traversing it, exemplified by missions 3 and 7. While they're obviously not on the level of Arcane or later CI titles, I generally felt like these maps gave me a decent amount of room to maneuver in most areas and a sense of genuine agency for most of their runtime. I'll be summarizing these from a more stealth-oriented perspective, since I believe you'll be able to get more out of them compared to just taking a loud approach all the time. The third mission, French Resistance, is the first France level in the game and is a big breath of fresh air after the more compact levels preceding it. While it's technically not that impressive in some aspects of its design, for some reason I have this weird bias towards it that makes it genuinely one of my favorite levels. As they say, facts are misleading, but rumors, true or false, are often revealing. The first area, a quaint little farm, provides a pretty good start with decent enough space to sneak around however you please towards the objective, and you can enter the little house from the front or the back. I think my favorite part about this area is this, I wouldn't say hidden, but perhaps easily ignored watermill that contains the first instance of a scoped Kar 98K, which is a nice way to reward keen-eyed players. And for some reason, as long as you stay inside the building, you can snipe every Nazi in the area without them hearing you. Be sure to grab the well rod in the house. After grabbing what you need, the game will send in a couple of guys in front of the house, but you can easily slip by them. After following a linear path and saving a French rebel if you want, you arrive at the next arena, a dilapidated town. Unfortunately, you might as well do this section loud. While the game still kinda provides a way to bypass enemies silently, you'll still trigger a tank spawn that blocks the exit, making it pointless. For what it's worth though, the town has a decent amount of vantage points for sniping and enough cover and space to flank enemies in the second half. It's pretty much the best you can do with otherwise average gunplay. Next up is another path leading to a villa with two distinct entrances. The more obvious path is the main gate, which is highlighted by this German soldier sprinting towards it before vanishing into thin air. This is clearly the tougher approach because there's more enemies and less cover, but if you manage to get the well rod from earlier, it makes it much more viable. The second entrance is a little more hidden, but this part of the courtyard has better cover, less enemies, and will lead you to the villa cellar where you can safely approach your target from behind. Afterwards is, again, a pretty linear path with a few enemies before you reach the ruins, which is also linear and not great. I've actually been able to sneak through this area, but it's probably not an intended approach. I managed to get a lucky lethal shot on a sniper with my well rod, which allowed me to slip inside undetected. But seeing as how you'll likely not notice him on a first playthrough and the overall simple design of the place, it really feels like you were meant to go guns blazing. Speaking of which, the final part of the level is a forced loud section in an arena of sorts. shortcuts. It has 2 entrances and is full of cover, has room to move around, and an elevated platform to snipe from. Again, it makes the most out of the average combat, so it's fine. With some pretty decent stealthable sections, serviceable enough loud sections, and how the level takes you on a seamless journey with a variety of different environments, French Resistance is overall an oddly satisfying experience, like watching Hans Landa eat a strudel. As for Mission 7, Chateau Assault in Lou Valley, it's conversely pretty short and more of a homogeneous experience all throughout. That being said, the majority of this level is honestly, in my opinion, the best designed part of the whole game. Because it takes place in a small town, there's a lot of different alleys, buildings that may contain a coveted sten, and other trails you can take to reach your objective. I expected to run into a lot of dead ends or invisible walls, but the level actually flows incredibly well, with most paths being equally effective for sneaking by enemies. The environment also lends itself to a lot of tension. Provided you're playing on experts so enemies aren't on the minimap, you'll probably want to be careful when you move around corners or exit buildings. Unfortunately, it does peter off towards the last quarter or so, with more confined design and then a forced loud section near the end. But most of Chateau Assault, while not say Thief 2, is genuinely so good for what it is that I'd be remiss to not rank it this high. Pas si mauvais. Missions 1, 5, 6, and 14 are the levels that I think are just decent enough. They play fine and still provide that sense of agency, but either lack something that makes the first 2 special or are flawed in some way. The first level, the first victory, is probably the best Warsaw level, for reasons that will become apparent. Like I said earlier, these areas are much smaller in size, knocking them down a peg, but nevertheless provide enough room to maneuver most of the time, with some nice shortcuts to avoid enemies or get the drop on them. Sections inside buildings obviously have more linear layouts, but there's still space to move around. Something interesting to note is that this level is the only time the game gives you the choice to complete 2 different areas in either order, but sadly it's more false agency. It doesn't matter what order you do them in, so it adds nothing. Besides that, it's mostly okay. The 5th mission, Sabotage in Lou Valley, has potential, but it falls a bit flat. The first area, some kind of wheat farm I think, is probably the biggest arena in the whole game, but unfortunately I can't say it translates to great design. Yes, there's technically plenty of room to maneuver, but this poorly lit wheat field allows you to bypass the one area that has a high concentration of enemies with 0 danger. By the way, there's a difference between a convenient path that either takes some finesse to reach or maintains a sense of precariousness, and something like this that isn't hidden at all and makes things too easy. There is a somewhat hidden path to your right after you spawn that allows you to make some progress, but by the end of it you'll have to jump down and risk getting spotted by no less than 3 guys if you want to cross to the other side. It's technically doable, but it's such a hassle that unfortunately, dominant strategy takes over. And when you reach the house containing the objective, you'll run into a problem where it only has 1 entrance with 1 guard nearby that barely moves. The issue with him is that you're likely going to be beneath the floorboards below him if you're trying to stealth, so you may not be able to tell what direction he's facing, so if you emerge at the wrong time, he'll spot you instantly.
Keep out, partisan!
So unless you manage to get the hidden well rod in that area, you'll probably have to get kinda lucky or punch the Nazi out like he's an undisclosed controversial figure. When you've completed your first objective, it's pretty much a linear path with 1 patrolling enemy and 3 guys to the left that basically won't pose a threat to blow up a bridge. After that, you run into a small lumberyard that leaves much to be desired with, to my knowledge, only 1 viable stealth path on the left side. I tried going to the right, but I ended up facing 1 stationary guy on my side, another stationary guy sitting right across, staring at me, with no easy way to squirm my way through unnoticed. The final area, some ruins, does pick up the slack a little with a more obvious path that does need a bit of awareness and finesse to get by, and a few handy shortcuts for those who notice them. Overall though, it just doesn't sit super well with me, but hate's a strong word for it. The 6th mission, Officer Hunt in Lou Valley, is probably the weakest France level due to its sheer simplicity. It's not bad, but it could be a lot better. It's still rather open, but there's a few gripes I have with the design. Like the town in Mission 3, the first officer you kill basically has to be taken on with a less subtle approach. The game even nudges you towards it by spawning you in a clear vantage point with a sniper rifle. But what kinda gives me blue balls is that when I decided to sneak to see if it was possible, the devs clearly designed that little area with enough cover and paths to be able to approach the group of Nazis from behind. But due to the enemy density and the lack of suppressed weaponry at this point in the map, you're inevitably gonna put them on alert if you kill anyone, making sneaking kinda pointless here. The next issue is that the following area feels too easy. It's nice and open, but there's barely anyone here, which sucks away all the tension. After that, it's pretty much over before you know it. Mission 14, Fire from the Sky, has a mix of good and bad. The level starts out very strong, with the path to the bunker having some perfectly solid design. There's a healthy number of enemies and tons of room and cover to sneak around. After that, you have the bunker, which is the exact opposite. Even though I managed to get through it undetected, it's so cramped that I'm convinced it was unintentional. When you exit, you have this sniping section that requires good timing with enemy positions and sound masking to do completely undetected. Nothing crazy, but it's satisfying. Then you have this building where it's a dull series of rooms with like 1 or 2 enemies each. Too easy. After that, you step foot into a V2 factory and it has the same issue as the one part in Mission 6. A nice big area with disappointingly low enemy density. After a quick force loud section, you approach a bunch of enemies working on some AA guns. Like the bunker, I somehow managed to clear it undetected even if it really wasn't designed for it. Finally, you reach a rocket field that's way too open, has way too little enemies, and again, it's way too easy. If it wasn't for the great start and satisfying sniping section, I would have ranked this whole level lower. Speaking of which, last and certainly least, there is unfortunately a significant portion of the campaign where either the majority of a mission or the whole mission will be little more than safe, sterile, scripted, spunk gargle wee wee. Yeah, so much for breaking out of the standard model of highly linear scripted FPS experiences. I see you under the fucking floorboards! Most of these are set in Warsaw, but Norway is also pretty guilty of this crap too. To be fair, these sections are in no way as bad as SGW1 because the gunplay is merely average, not an affront to Ian McCollum. But I'm not gonna bother explaining these in full detail. You can probably already tell from the footage how derivative and uninteresting these levels are. There's nothing to uncover. Except for one. Mission 12, Home Army Victorious, is actually terrible. While the others are at least over quickly, this one is so drawn out it's not even funny. First of all, it's a defense section, so all you're gonna be doing is standing in the same place, endlessly popping Nazis for way too long. On top of that, you have to wait for various objectives like killing officers and destroying vehicles to appear, so you don't have any control over how quickly you can get the level done and over with. And after you're done with that barricade,
And it's just a start! Every man barricade!
oh God! Yep, you gotta repeat that whole song and dance all over again. And don't you dare die, because if you do, you'll have to start at the very beginning of that defense section and wait for objectives to appear again! Making things even worse is that I happened to run into a couple of technical issues too! The first thing that happened is that I got soft-locked. Here, I had already destroyed 2 half-tracks as per the objectives, but the game simply didn't acknowledge that I did, so I had to restart. I also had a random crash while playing it. Granted, I don't know what caused the crash, so it could have happened at any other point in the game, but down with this level all the way down, I'm blaming it. I don't know how I even forgot how bad this level was. Another level I really want to tear apart is the one that just so happens to be immediately after Home Army defeated. V2 attack. Picture the scene. I just got done with the tedious, monotonous slog and was delighted to relearn that the next level isn't in Warsaw, meaning there's a lower chance of spunk gargle wee wee. Except that I had forgotten that this is easily the most lazily designed level that's supposedly meant to be open. The level starts off way too easy. It's literally an open field with Nazis clustered in the middle, and you can just walk around them. There's no tension to it, nor feeling like you discovered the best way to stealth past it. The same can mostly be said about entering the POW camp. Pop a couple of lone guys with sound masking, walk around the cluster of enemies, get inside, kill a couple of more enemies, and then proceed to the lazy bullshit fest that is this next section. The problem with this part is that it's way too linear, small, and there's way too many enemies. Look at what you're almost immediately greeted with. What's basically a hallway with 3 enemies in very close proximity and no alternate paths to discover to get by. You have to brute force it. What makes this section so difficult is this damn spotlight guy. Obviously, he'll easily spot anyone you kill on the ground. But if you kill him, it seems that the enemies will realize the light went out and go on alert. You also can't distract him with rocks. Not properly anyway.
Hier gibt es Ärger!
Even if you get really lucky and manage to kill all 3 without raising an alarm, the following section is pretty much the same thing, but worse. A whole fucking courtyard full of Nazis, a spotlight guy, and very little cover for you or corpses. I've tried to stealth through this section countless times to make sure it just wasn't me being bad, and I just gave up when this happened on an otherwise lucky run.
Aufstehen!
But Mr. Phann, you might be wondering, maybe this section is meant to be loud like some of the other areas. If that were the case, I would have gone on that assumption and wouldn't have bothered to rant about this level. However, I have proof that this was intended to be stealthable. There's an achievement for freeing your buddy on this map without raising an alarm. An achievement that, by the way, is tied for the least earned in the whole game, only beaten by achievements for the multiplayer that nobody played. Kudos to those guys. I have no idea how they did it. As for me, je lui dis adieu. Finally, there's a bonus mission, Raid on Saint Nazaire, included in the special edition of the game, which means I don't have it and there's no way to get it as far as I know. From what I can tell from videos, we're not missing much. It seems like a mostly uninteresting, ugly-ass map that has nothing to do with the nothingy main story, can be beaten in less than 20 minutes, and just kinda falls apart at certain points. At least the main character is very British.
Why the deuce am I here? North Africa's on fire. All hands needed.
I did have something else I wanted to tell you. But right now, for the life of me, I can't remember what it is. Oh well, must not have been important. So, I'm not really sure what happened. Could be the boomer shooters for Algernon effect, or maybe I was just really stupid, but Enemy Front is a far more inconsistent experience than I remember. The game shines well enough when you treat it like a tense and atmospheric stealth game in its better levels, but the campaign is weighed down by the open levels sometimes not being very fun to play due to iffy design, and of course the abundance of spunk gargle wee wee that this game supposedly tried to avoid. I wouldn't recommend this game to most people, but I wouldn't caution against it either, and I fucking mean it this time! But despite the numerous issues, there's still a big part of me that holds some respect for this game. I think it marks an important step in CI's slow but steady growth as a studio as they decided to transition to more open and frankly straight up better level design. Something that would be put to the extreme in the very next game in their library. But until next time, au revoir, Shoshana!